Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is 4 o'clock. Council does not have a quorum at this time, so I will not call the meeting to order for us, but I will turn it over to Planning Board Chairman, Mr. Yurchat.
Well, thank you. I am going to call this meeting of the Planning Board in session, and if you would do a roll call for us, that would be great.
Richard Yurchat.
I am here.
Jennifer Smith. Here. Richard Ali.
Here.
Patrick Burke. Margaret Dezio.
Here.
Archie Morgan.
Here.
Kenneth Deal. Here. David Dawson.
Here, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Just to inform you, I'd like to welcome our guests. Appreciate you taking the time to come to this meeting. It is a special meeting, a meeting that we will follow the agenda set for both the Planning Board and the Council. There will be no public discussion. However, you're certainly welcome to come to our council meeting and express any thoughts you may have. So I will now turn it over to Doug Britt.
Thank you. Thank you. Doug Britt in the Planning Department, and basically the purpose today is we're going to go through a few things and hoping to get some feedback from both Planning Board and Council to give staff a little direction. Because, as you recall, we adopted the code in April of 2012. And, we said at that point in time that we'd be back for sure with some things that we need to iron out. And this is what we're back here to do, start doing today, though. So I'll kind of go through the agenda. And both myself, Lisa, and Carrie will all be making, contributing to the presentation today. And if you have any questions, there's she is. I just started.
Excuse me just one second.
Yes.
On behalf of City Council, let me call our meeting to order since we do have a quorum present.
Planning Board, present.
And accounted for.
Late, but here.
Planning Board, did y'all call the order?
We are called to order. We are orderly, at least for now.
Okay. So good afternoon. I'm Lisa Steinwinter, Director of Planning and Development with the City of Monroe. And here today, joining in the presentation will be Doug Britt, Senior Planner, and then Carrie Mendler, one of our other senior planners with the Planning and Development Department. I just want to thank Planning Board and Council and the citizens that have joined us. Purpose for today is to have general ordinance of the Unified Development Ordinance discussion. And then we are requesting that, requesting Planning Board consider taking action on various text amendments of Chapter 157, the Unified Development Ordinance. So today's meeting agenda, we will kind of touch on the purpose of the Unified Development Ordinance, some pros and cons that of the ordinance that we've experienced over the last 6 months. We'll discuss the proposed zoning text amendment and recommendations. We will have more detailed discussion about the landscaping and buffering section, and of course there'll be time for discussion and questions. So the new Unified Development Ordinance is a consolidated document of all that contains the city's land use and development requirements. And the document was adopted April 12th, 2022. So we have been using the ordinance for approximately 6 months now. The goal was always to develop a clear and user-friendly UDO that's consistent with the city's plans and policies. And the UDO does codify the requirements for specific uses, densities, and site plan requirements that assist in implementing the future land use plan that was adopted in 2018. Just a reminder, the Unified Development Ordinance is the main tool to implement the future land use plan, and it does respond to the community values and goals and policies and strategies that was identified in that land use plan update that was adopted in 2018. So some of the pros about the Unified Development Ordinance are some of the common items. It's a more clear and user-friendly document. It's a new document. It's not outdated from 2000. It does implement the goals and recommendations of the land use plan. It sets predictable set of land use regulations, not only for planning staff, but for council and planning board, the citizens and developers to be able to use it. And it provides graphics and illustrations. But some of the main things that we do planning staff likes about the ordinance. It did introduce mixed-use zoning districts. It added more than one commercial district. It added more than one industrial district. It did provide an expanded table of uses. We had a very limited table of uses that were allowed in different zoning districts. We didn't have open space requirements or parking requirements, and it did reduce the reliance on conditional district rezonings, which is one of the comments that we heard going into drafting the Unified Development Ordinance was there was too many conditional rezoning. So that was one of the goals that was set out with the new Unified Development Ordinance. Some areas that over the last 6 months planning staff has experienced that need some improvement, some more than others. The landscaping and buffering, mixed-use zoning district incentives, the conservation subdivision section, and the open space standards. After further discussion by staff, we realized these are kind of major text amendments. All the other ones that we'll discuss today are more technical in nature, minor. Due to the complexity of the number of major ones, we've decided that we will just focus on landscaping and buffering for discussion. And we will bring forward the additional major text amendments in the future. Now, keep in mind, the meeting was advertised for general ordinance discussion, so if, there's something pressing in one of these items, the body can certainly decide to talk about it, but for planning's purposes, we're going to focus mainly on landscaping and buffering for time purposes. So just, as I mentioned, there are several text amendments that are more technical and minor in nature. I'm just going to go over a few of them, and then I'll turn it over to Doug and Carrie to touch on some of them as well. Two of the areas was in the Section 3 administration. We forgot to add information for the boards, Planning Board and Board of Adjustment, that it requires a resident of the extraterritorial zoning jurisdiction be a member on the board. So that was in the old ordinance. It didn't carry forward in the new one. And then also the general statute was updated. So we needed to clean that language up and make sure we had that provided. The same with planning board. Another section was in Section 3 regarding zoning permits. A zoning permit is required for development that does not require an engineered site plan. So any use of property that's changed, or you have clearing or grading, or you're going to be constructing or moving or altering anything, it does require a permit, a zoning permit, and that was not included as part of the Section 3 for zoning permits. One section in the mixed-use zoning district parking standards. This section referenced Section 8 regarding parking standards, and basically what this section also had an area that said the mixed-use zoning districts should have their own set of parking standards, and it referenced Section 8, but when you went to Section 8 there were no parking standards. So there's not any reason the mixed-use zoning districts should have a separate section, so it will now refer to the parking standards for all districts. Another section that this is being proposed to be removed completely is Section 6 regarding floodplain and floodway districts. In the floodway and floodplain districts is an ordinance or section of the ordinance that's really enforced by the engineering department. It's always been in the Unified Development Ordinance, so it carried forward. But the North Carolina State Department of Emergency Management has advised the city that this should be a standalone ordinance. So we were proposing to remove it from the Unified Development Ordinance, and then the engineering department has a call for public hearing to place it in one of their ordinances on the November 8th City Council meeting. And I will turn it over to Carrie Mindler to discuss the table of uses.
Good evening, Carrie Mindler, Planning Department. The first sort of section that I have is Section 7, which is the table of permissible uses. We have a couple of small changes proposed. The first one is allowing upper story residential in the office medical district. In the current code, I believe this was a special use permit, and we are proposing to change that as allowed by right. That does just allow, basically, if you have an office building in an office medical zoning district, you could have apartments or units above that could be used for residential purposes. The density would still be capped at what is already allowed in the office medical district, and parking would follow the existing parking limits in the code. This really adds additional housing choices, and this is something already allowed in downtown as well, so it's just expanding additional housing options. The next one is personal services, also to allow by right in the office medical district. Personal services, for example, are hair salons or barber or nail or computer repair place. And so retail is already permitted in office medical with a special use permit, which is more intense than personal services typically are. So we are proposing that that just be allowed by right. It was also allowed by right in the sister zoning district, office transitional in the old zoning code. So just one of those things we believe makes sense in that district. The next change is the residential uses for the standards for townhouses or attached single-family homes. Currently, we do not have a minimum lot width for townhomes in the code. And we believe that that could lead to some potential problems of people maybe trying to do a 16-foot wide townhome or even smaller, which at this point they could do. So we wanting to further regulate that by requiring at least a 20-foot wide townhome. We did some research. Other jurisdictions have between 16 and 24-foot wide townhome widths. And so we kind of went in the middle and have proposed a 20-foot wide townhome as a minimum for those townhomes. The next is just clarification on electronic gaming operations, just further clarifying that they do have to have a conditional rezoning, which would, of course, come before planning board and city council for approval. Code really implies that, but it doesn't explicitly say that, so that's just clarification. The next section was accessory uses and structures. This is really just removing some language that have to do with the appearance of the accessory structures. We can't do that for residential for the houses themselves, so we certainly can't do that for the accessory structures, as well as clarifying or cleaning up some language about the location of the accessory structures. Yeah, I'll turn over to Doug for a quick second.
This first section is involving performance bonds. Just kind of give you a little background about what performance bonds are. Is when somebody develops a piece of property, they have to develop it, get approved, and then they record a final plat. And when they record that final plat, the plat shows all the lots, shows the roads. But when they record that final plat, the roads and everything doesn't have to be necessarily all completed. So, but what they do is they put up a surety or a guarantee money at 110% of what the cost will be to complete it. And so that's what we require when they do that. And just kind of give you an idea, I mean, I think because I updated it yesterday, we are currently holding, and surety is either in the form of a letter of credit that comes from a bank, a cashier's check, or a bond that's issued from an insurance company. I think right now we have 52 different forms of sureties over all the projects we're doing that are just a hair over $34 million we're currently holding for all the projects that are under construction. So basically for the performance bonds, there's first part removal of requirement for maintenance bonds. The maintenance bonds, that was basically not allowed by the state legislature about a year or so ago, but it was put in here by accident, so we're just requesting to take that out. And the maintenance bond was, after we took over the road for maintenance, that we used to hold a surety or guarantee, and that if something happened, that developer we still had developers' money, but like I said, the state legislature took that ability away from us to be able to hold that, so we're just asking to take that out. And then we added language that was in the previous code for bond reduction. what happens is, let's say, we have a couple sureties. Probably, I think our highest one is a little over $5 million, but for the most part, we usually go between, I'd say, $5 million up to about $2 million we'll hold. And once they get so far along, the developer will be saying, hey, City Monroe, we've done probably 75% of the improvements that's done, and we would like to get some of our money back. So what the city has allowed in the past, in the previous code that wasn't carried forward in the new code, was they're allowed to have it used to be a one-time reduction, not less than 50% of the original bond amount. So if the bond amount they was putting up for subdivision X required $2 million, what they put up, once they got at least 50% of the work done, they could ask for a one-time reduction down to $1 million. And we wouldn't go below the $1 million, and we would hold that final amount until we finally take over all the streets in the subdivision or take over the streets for that particular map. So what we're asking to do is put the bond reduction language back in the ordinance. So that was that section. The next section was 157.8.1.7 subdivision standards. And this involves primarily when we do minor subdivisions. It was in our old code that if you create a lot that doesn't have road frontage along a public street, you're required in the old code to have a access easement that served that lot. The easement was supposed to be 20 feet or 18 feet wide, and of that 18 feet, 12 feet was required to be paved. The easement language is still in there, but what's not in there in the current code was the requirement to pave it. So we're requesting to add that back in, and that would be paid from the public right-of-way, a public street, to that lot line, or that lot line that doesn't have access along a street. So that was involving that section. Carrie's got it next.
Keep you on your toes. All right, so this next section is signage. We have proposed to add the general industrial district as far as allowing a digital changeable copy signs. And basically, digital changeable copy sign is just a sign that changes digitally. So like the Solar Shine car wash sign, and like Sonic, they have them where there's messages scrolling, or a lot of churches and schools have them as well. And so it's allowed in general business currently. We believe that general industrial is appropriate for those signage uses as well. And then this next one involves monument or community signs to be allowed in residential zoning districts. As we started implementing the code and have people ask us questions about signage, we realized that residential neighborhoods, if they are, say, developed by right under the code, there's no avenue for them to have their sign out front of the neighborhood that specifically says, you know, this is the neighborhood name. Also, churches and schools typically fall within residential zoning districts, so there's no avenue currently for them to have signage. So that's why we are proposing to just include those in the residential districts. And the allowable size is currently in the code, and that's based off of the acreage of the sites. So it was simply just allowing them in that zoning district.
Carrie,
Yeah.
just one quick question. On that changeable copy sign,
Yes.
we're adding general industrial,
Mhm.
and what other districts?
General business, it's currently allowed in general business. So we're just adding to, or asking to add general industrial as an allowed district.
General business would be common.
Usually you'll see them in general business currently, but we've had some industrial sites ask about them.
I had heard before, some people suggested that they had to ask for some special appointment for that changeable.
They're not currently allowed in residential districts. There are some schools and churches in the past that have gone through a process in order to have them at their church or school. So that might be what you're thinking of.
Well, was it that there was another business that was here? I don't want to name any names, I'm just curious about that. It just
Yeah.
doesn't come up that often, but they're
Yeah.
common nowadays.
They are, yeah, and there was some distance requirements, so maybe it was a distance. There was one within a certain distance.
Okay.
Okay, I have the next three. This first one being the street yard buffer, 157.8.3.7. And the street yard buffer is whenever you have a development, you have the public street and the public right-of-ways adjacent to that street. And what we have is usually, and even in the old code, we had it where it's called a streetscape buffer, but street yard buffer is the same thing. And what it is where you would not want somebody to pave all the way up to the edge of the right-of-way, and so we always had this buffer. And in the previous code, it was 8 feet, and then when we adopted the new code, it was we modified that to 20 feet. And just so far with especially commercial projects, it just, I mean, and along Highway 74, it just gets the developable area that you're looking for parking and building and whatever improvements you're having to do it. It starts shrinking it, and Carrie's going to go into more about the landscape and the buffers a little bit later, but the street yard buffer was one that we thought was fairly minor in nature, and just asking to reduce that from 20 feet down to 10 feet. And still you can get, it's required to be improved with shrubs and trees, so you can still get everything in the 10 feet as you get in the 20 feet, but it just makes the site a little more easier from a commercial standpoint to be developable. The design standards, basically, and we had adopted this, we had this in the old code, basically where you review the architectural requirements, what the building's gonna look like for commercial districts. And when we adopted the current code, we put that threshold in there as at 5,000 square feet. There's, you know, a lot of the commercial stuff that we review, especially fast food, stuff like that, a lot of those are less than 5,000 square feet. And so what we did, we wanted to lower that threshold to 2,500 square feet. Now, the 2,500 square feet doesn't get everything, because for instance, like the Scooters Coffee Shop, that's less than 1,000 square feet. And we reviewed another coffee shop that's eventually coming, that was less than 1,000 square feet too. But those are so small and insignificant in nature, you know, usually what they're doing is fine, but we wanted to lower that threshold to have some architectural requirements for the larger, you know, commercial buildings. So we are asking to take that down from 5,000 to 2,500 square feet. And then the last one here is dealing with nonconformities. And I'll say nonconformities or grandfather stats, and it's in 157.10. And nonconformity or grandfather use is something that's currently out there, that's not allowed in the current code. So it's grandfathered. So, and I'll give an example of, you know, let's say you had a duplex that was out on a piece of property, and may not be allowed in the current code. And the way it's been done over the years in the old code was, if that duplex went completely vacant and dormant, utilities cut off for more than 180 consecutive days, if somebody wanted to come back in after that 180 days, they wanted to open back up for a duplex, we wouldn't let them, because we would say it's gone beyond that 180-day period. When we adopted the current code back in April, it was modified to 365 days. So basically we added another half year to that. So we're requesting to go back to 180 days, just in the event too, because the idea of nonconformities is you're not telling those people they got to stop doing what they're doing now, but what you do with nonconformities, you phase those out over years. I mean, it might take 20 years to get them, but the idea of nonconformity is eventually that nonconforming use will phase out over time. And so what we're asking to do is reduce that 365 back to 180.
So that concludes our technical or minor modifications to the Unified Development Ordinance. If Planning Board is agreeable, planning staff would appreciate them consider taking action. It's no by all means, you know, that you have to take action, but these were all technical, minor in nature. Or if there's any additional questions I can answer on any of those that were just mentioned before we go into the landscaping and buffering.
So does planning have any questions about the issues that were brought up? I think Lisa's asking us specifically if we'll approve a resolution to send it to council.
I only have one.
Sure.
I noticed in the accessory uses that it removes, and I'm going to try to find exactly what I'm talking about. You removed a section that just says, it will not likely attract visitors in large numbers or larger than could be normally expected for an accessory use. that's just something that had to go out because it wasn't. Another reason I'm asking, if you started using something for secondary use and it drew a large crowd in an area that just wasn't.
Was that located within the home occupation section?
No, it's in the accessory use, let's see if I can find it here. 7.5 maybe? 7.5. A. It says general accessory use standards, and it just remove, I mean, I'm just asking just because I was
Right, I
curious on
think
what it's on.
they're gonna look, I don't have it, I didn't bring it up right here.
Okay, 7.5 is entitled, which number did you say it was?
It's gone, but it was in section 2. It says shall. And it says shall be accessory and clearly incidental and subordinate to the permanent uses of the structures. And it goes down, and the former iteration of this had a D, obviously under the C, and it just said not likely to attract visitors in large numbers that were more than normally to be expected.
I think that that was just something that when staff was looking at this section, it's not really appropriate for accessory uses, so sort of
Gotcha.
cleaning up some of that language.
Works for me.
Sounds something that would be in a home occupation section that you wouldn't want to see happen.
Which I believe is still in the home occupation section, so I believe it's just one of those kind of clearing up language.
Yes, sir.
Sometimes I know in planning board it comes up and the historic district also comes up. When people have not done a COA and they just went out and built a storage building per se. And months, years go by and it's still there. Cities told them, code enforcement's told them to take it down, put the proper siding up, the proper shingle, whatever the problem was. Is there any, can we put any more teeth into things like that? People are running off in the historic district doing what they want, not getting the COA. Sometimes code enforcement catches them, and then staff looks into it, sees what they've done, and then if they need a COA, then they come before us. But sometimes things are done and goes against, the rules, and they never fix it.
Can I speak to that? Okay. Well, as far as putting more teeth into it, and Ashley, correct me if I'm wrong, but it would go through the zoning violation process, which, as you know, we try to do that. But of course, if they've already applied for permits and they've gotten the COA approval, the permit is valid until it expires. And I can't put them in violation, or proceed with the violation process until said permit expires, if there's no work, that has been done to come into compliance. I know that probably doesn't exactly answer your question, but
No, I'm talking about projects that are finished and shouldn't be that way.
when that's
do
when
the
we can
rules.
do the violation process.
There is an enforcement
I
section.
don't see that happening. You know the storage building we're talking about, we've talked about that ever since I've been on the board.
And they have permits, so I can't go through the violation process until the permit expires.
And let me just say, since this is a special meeting, we can't talk about a specific project, but we have to keep it to the
I'm not
UDO.
trying to,
Okay,
just asking in general.
make sure. We have to keep it to the UDO.
We can certainly talk online or offline more about that one. There are some other things involved.
And there is an enforcement section as part of the Unified Development Ordinance. Not to say we can't do research in other municipalities to make sure that we're not missing something that we could be doing that we're not doing. So we certainly can look in that as well.
May I ask a question? Just, do they apply for the permit in a circumstance, hypothetically, in a circumstance like that first, and then the COA, or what's the process?
Depends on what type of work they're doing in the historic district. If it's under the ordinance, if it's a major or minor improvement, that determines whether it's a board level approval or a staff level approval. If it's a either way, with either of those, you would get the COA first and then the permit.
So would they have to prove they have the COA to get the permit?
Yes.
Would that not check itself, balances, or should it not balance itself out? I mean, that's a real
Sometimes
basic
people
question.
can have a COA, and they come before us and tell us what they want to do, and then when it comes to project time,
I
they
see.
don't do it the way we
I see.
recommended.
Okay.
And that's where the city goes back and looks at the project once it's finished,
I see.
more or less.
Okay.
Carrie, can you and Archie just circle back up on this? Okay. Is that good?
Sure.
Thank
All
you.
right.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
These utility buildings that people get and put up, you know, they could maybe get from Home Depot or build their own or whatever. Do you have to have a permit or certificate, COA to do that?
You should have a zoning permit to put up an accessory building, and then if it's over a certain size, you're supposed to have a building permit as well. Correct me if I'm wrong.
And of course, a COA, but only if you're in the historic district.
Well, yeah, that's what I meant. If they put it up anyway and
It
you know,
would go through
without
the
getting any,
violation process.
okay.
All right. Planning board, are there any further questions?
I've got one.
Okay.
On the residential uses, 157.7.2.4, where you're recommending to add a minimum of 20-foot wide for townhomes, you indicated that there were, you looked at the municipalities around us, and it ranged anywhere from 24 to 18 foot as a standard.
Yes, some went all the way down to 16, but usually 16 to 24, sort of that range.
Okay. As, you know, being the county seat for Union County, I think that if we put this in there, then we should at least uphold the best of the minimum standards around us, which would be 24 foot, not split the difference between the examples that we had and arrive at 20 feet. 20 feet is not a lot of space. There's almost 20 feet between you and our. I think that if we changed it or add this in there, then it would be prudent to at least add it in as 24 feet, not 20 feet. That's my opinion on
Anybody else have an opinion on 20 versus 24?
I think the bigger the better, to be quite honest with you.
Well, you know, we're trying to bring better developments, more buffers and, you know, bigger trees and more amenities, why not wider?
Right.
We don't have an economy of land around here that we have to put as many people on the smallest footprint that we can possibly put them. Townhome living is not the greatest living circumstance to begin with. They typically are rental properties, or they wind up being rental properties bought up by these mega corporations that move in. Their maintenance goes down quickly, and you know, they can be picked up for the cheapest cost when the maintenance falls down. I just think we should be offering our citizens better housing, and 24 foot is a lot better than 20 feet, unless if anybody's converted their garage to a living space, you can probably identify how small that is.
Staff, any comments?
You know, we did the research, we gave the ranges, we just landed in the middle. It's at the discretion of the boards as to whether they want to modify the townhome width from 20 to 24. Currently, we don't have any lot width for it. I mean, any width criteria in the ordinance, so anything's better than nothing.
Can I have a straw poll amongst the planning board members, 20 versus 24? Who wants 20? Who wants 24? Straw poll wins. So we're going to modify that to 24 as we vote on it.
So whoever makes the motion, they can just put that as a condition for the resolution and also the ordinance.
Ken will be making that motion.
I'm sure no other comments in any other.
No, I was just, you know. Are there any further comments as it relates to 2024 or section 157, spot 7, spot 2, spot 4? Do we have any further discussion as it relates to the presentation from staff? Not hearing none. I would entertain a motion to approve or deny the resolution of the land use and transportation plan compliance as it was presented.
I make a motion that we recommend acceptance as presented by staff with the exception of the townhome minimum standard size to read 24 feet, vice 20 feet.
Second.
I have a first and a second, and I'm going to read, do we need to read the,
I'm gonna call for a vote first.
all right. So all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? So that was unanimous. All right, so now I'm going to make a motion to recommend adoption of the ordinance amending Chapter 157, Section 3.3.3, Board of Adjustments, Section 3.3.4, Planning Board, and Section 3.4.20, Zoning Permits, Section 5.9, Mixed Use Zoning District Parking Standards, and Section 5.10, Mixed Use Zoning District Incentives, Section 6.1.1.
Mr. Chairman, I think you might have a different sheet.
We haven't discussed any of the.
Wow, okay.
I think that
We
was.
slimmed it down. I'm
That's
sorry.
right.
So it's,
So we're just going to, I can't read that, so I can read this one. Is this one good to go?
yes, sir.
Okay. Motion to recommend adoption of the ordinance amending Chapter 157, Section 3.3.3, Board of Adjustments, Section 3.3.4, Planning Board, and Section 3.4.20, Zoning Permit, Section 5.9, Mixed Use Zoning District Parking Standards, Section 6.1.1, Floodplain and Floodway Districts, Section 7, Permissible Use and Standards, Section 8.1, Subdivision Sections 8.2, Signs, Section 8.4.2, Parking Requirements, Section 8.7.1, General Provisions, Section 10, Nonconformities, and Section 11, Definitions of Terms of the UDO.
Did we cover all those?
Yes, we did.
Okay, I'll
And
second.
just to clarify, that motion includes the condition that was in the resolution.
With
as
the
well?
additional condition presented by Ken.
I'll second that.
All right, I have a second. Is there any further discussion as it relates to that motion of approval? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Phew, somebody's got to read the next one. I can't do that twice. That was unanimous.
Thank you.
Doug is passing out a couple of other documents. This is a little bit more of an in-depth text amendment, one of a few that you'll hear in the future, not tonight. But today, we're just going to talk about perimeter buffers. It is a fair amount of information, so I will try to be slow while I explain it. But Doug is passing out some maps that are up on the screen as well. It's just so that you can follow along a little bit better with something that you can look at. As I stated, landscaping buffers, perimeter buffers, are new to the zoning ordinance. New to the zoning ordinance, and this is for redevelopment of properties, or if you're developing property that is currently vacant. And basically, we've had some people come in, and they've asked about either redeveloping a property, which starts our process as far as looking at the ordinance to determine what they have to do in regards to buffering, parking, design elements, sort of starts that process. And the first one that you typically look at are setbacks and landscaping, because you kind of work backwards and find out how much room do I actually have to work with, which has basically led staff to discover that the current buffers are causing some potential issues as far as taking a fair amount of land and dedicating it to landscape buffers, which isn't necessarily bad, but at the point that we're at right now, it's a little excessive in staff's opinion. So we have a couple of examples that we'll go through. The first one that I'm going to go through is property off of Ellen Street. So that's off of Ellen, which is just south of the hospital, off of East Franklin.
This,
Ellen Street is the first one.
Hey, this is
Which
the
one?
Ellen Street one right here, guys.
Let's see that
And it's
picture.
on the screen as well. You can kind of match up the site shape.
Well, that's in the original.
this one, I think I got two copies.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah, these are just bigger versions that Doug's putting in front of you. It's in your PowerPoint.
Okay.
All right, so Ellen Street's the little one, got the little plot.
Sorry, should have put them in order.
No, exactly.
Yeah, so it's on the screen as well, but just wanted to give you guys a couple extra copies so you can actually view it better. So first example, like I said, it is Ellen Street, just south of the hospital. It's zoned office medical, and the properties surrounding it are also zoned office medical. And as well as a piece of property in a little neighborhood to the west of this site. So just quickly looking, the site is highlighted in blue, subject property. This green that you kind of see around the site is what's basically dedicated to buffers. So as I stated, this property in particular is zoned office medical, and the property to the northwest, east, and south are also zoned office medical. So it's same zoning districts, but they have to do a type 3 25-foot buffer. And within that buffer, you would have a mix of trees, shrubs, and a fence. And then along the western property line, there is a type 4 or a 50-foot wide buffer. So a couple key takeaways is down in the bottom left corner, you'll see kind of a site data table. So this site is actually a little over half an acre. But 0.35 acres, about 15,000 square feet of the site itself, is dedicated to landscape buffers. That's over 50% of the actual site, which is dedicated strictly to landscape buffers. That is, does not include where the building is going to go, does not include where your stormwater is going to go. It doesn't include where your parking is going. That's strictly landscape buffers. So it only leaves them with less than 10,000 square feet. Less than half of the site can actually be developed for parking, building, etc. Versus the proposed, which is stapled to Ellen Street. And this is basically what we are proposing in this particular instance. Again, those properties are still zoned office medical, but we are proposing that instead of a type 3 25-foot buffer to adjacent and same zoning districts, we're proposing that to be a 10-foot buffer. So you'd still have buffering, you'd still have landscaping, it just wouldn't be as much given that they are still the same zoning district. And in this particular case, along the residential to the west, we are proposing the change to be from a type 4 50-foot down to a type 3 25-foot buffer. So you will still have a buffer, you still have landscaping, trees, shrubs. It will just be slightly less. And it does work out this way for office medical simply because office medical is less intense uses than, say, general business. So that is wouldn't be the same case as a general business zone district. And again, just a couple key takeaways on the bottom left. The site data, you are doing only about 31% of the site is dedicated to buffers. So you're allowing the property owner to actually have more room to work with for their parking, for their building, for their stormwater. You still have buffers, it just allows them to actually work with the site, compared to what they could currently work with under the current standards. Does anybody have questions about this one before I move on?
So I got a question. So up on the original one, in the type 4 buffer, if I'm looking at your permitted buffer types and tables, that applicant would have to build a 6-foot wall and run it across the
Correct.
back of his property, his or her property?
Yes, so
Is there a limit on that? So if they, let's just say they were taking that whole page, they would have to have a 6-foot wall for 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet, whatever it was?
yep, it's a 6 foot in the current standards for a type 4 buffer. It is a 6-foot wall, and that's different than a fence. A fence is a fence that is maybe PVC or wood. A wall is a masonry wall. And yes, it follows it's a perimeter buffer, so it would follow the perimeter.
That's gonna kill some projects.
It has to the project so far.
Yes, and has certainly raised concerns for people trying to develop their commercial properties.
The 6-foot wall.
A 6-foot wall, and just the buffers in general. You're going from over 50% of the site being dedicated to buffers,
Project.
let alone your actual building, parking, etc. Yes, Archie?
Was there a reason why the buffers in staff's mind got too big and now need to be, what's the history on it? Were they slim and made bigger and now we want to make them smaller?
So in the old code, prior to April, we didn't have buffers to this extent. There were buffers, so if you were commercial or industrial, you'd have either a 50 or a 75-foot buffer if you were adjacent to residential. But there weren't buffers regardless of zoning. It was usually just if you're commercial against residential. So there wasn't much, and then we kind of took it to the extreme opposite. And of course, as you're writing these text amendments and UDOs, sometimes you don't fully understand how it's going to actually play out until you start implementing and fielding those questions. And so that was, I think that, in fact, this particular property, the owner came in either a week after this document was adopted, and we realized this isn't working for the buffers. So we almost went from one extreme opposite to the next, and so we're kind of trying to come back to the middle. Is kind of our goal.
If memory serves me correct, the main complaint we had on the buffering was between existing residential.
Mm-hmm.
I don't recall that same complaint against like commercial. So in other words here, this lot beside it, which is obviously already developed,
Right.
doesn't have,
Exactly.
50, 25, 20, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, which should certainly be the case for existing residential as well. So kind of that new development coming in. Like existing residential districts don't always have buffers up against new
Yeah, I get that,
developments.
but this is not residential.
Right.
It's just, all these properties right here are commercial.
Right, with the exception of the residential to the west.
To the left of it.
Residential to the west.
There's a small neighborhood just to the west of this.
Right here?
Mhm.
Right there.
Yeah, so there is an increased buffer of office medical to residential. But yes, in between those like zoning districts, we did and have proposed to reduce those. Still have them because you don't want pavement up against pavement. It does increase the aesthetics of an area when you have that landscaping. And of course, trees are beneficial to all of us. So we don't think that necessarily getting rid of the buffers entirely between commercial to commercial, we don't think that's the best. But we do believe that they should be slimmed down.
Hey, Carrie, just if I may add, and I think it may be helpful to go through the next example and then look at our buffer types in our chart that we use the buffer types between uses for everyone to better understand how the buffer types are proposed, and then how the chart is identifying this buffer type is between these uses and so forth. It might put it all into perspective a little bit better than just after go over a couple of the examples and then go into that.
Yeah, and that's what we kind of wanted to make sure you guys had an understanding of, kind of where we're at currently, and then kind of get into more of what we're proposing. But just this helps at least visualize it. The next one we're doing is this one, and it's actually adjacent to rolling hills, so you'll see a lot of green space behind it versus a parking lot. So this one is, of course, on Highway 74 or West Roosevelt Boulevard. It does have general business zoning on either side of it, and then the property to the back of it is zoned residential low density. So that first map you can see, currently we've got a 25-foot buffer, which is a type 3 on either side. So they would have to do the 25-foot as well as a fence on both sides, which does create some problems in staff's opinion, as far as every project having a fence doesn't exactly create community. It kind of breaks you off into your own little pocket of land, which isn't ideal for commercial. The type 4 buffer, which is along the residential, is a 50-foot buffer, and we are not proposing to change that. So if you have a general business owned property and you're up against residential, you would still have a 50-foot buffer along that residential property. So that would not be changed. But we are proposing to change the side buffers, which will be the back sheet, again to that 10-foot buffer, or a type 1, in between those same zonings. So again, you don't have all that pavement to pavement. You have some landscaping, aesthetics, additional trees, but there would be no wall as well or fence along those side property lines. Again, creating almost this prison-like barrier in between commercial and commercial. And just, again, key takeaways at the bottom left of both of those pages. You're going from about 34% dedicated to buffers, about 46% down to 34%. So still have buffers, just requesting to reduce those when you are adjacent to the same zoning district. And I'll just quickly go over this last example. This is the Shomar site. And this is an existing site, as you guys know, but if they were to want to redevelop it under current UDO standards, again, you can see the first example as far as the buffers there. We've got a type 3 25-foot buffer. Currently, it's got the same zoning on all 3 sides. We are proposing again to drop that down to the type 1 10-foot buffer. Again, similar reasons. It's the same zoning. They're all commercial. You still have the aesthetics, just not taking as much land and dedicating it strictly to buffers. And this doesn't include any parking landscaping as well, which the ordinance does require. So there would still be parking lot landscaping intermingled into the site.
So I'm not understanding this correctly then, to change this to that type 1, there is no fence.
Right.
Only 10 foot in width. That 3 trees, is that,
It would be
what
per
length
100. It'd be per 100 linear feet. I realize that that's missing as well, but yeah.
You gotta have the 3 trees plus the 20 shrubs.
Correct. And that would just be per 100 foot of the actual property line. So it would be spread out along the property lines, of course.
Well, I don't mind telling you, and I don't want to, buffering, well, this new UDO is being proposed, and we were holding meetings, and we had people to show up to talk about this. They were very adamant about it. And, but most of the real complaints I was hearing was from residential, and no clear cut to the property line.
Right.
Now, you know, I don't, so, you know, so I see this, I mean, you're dramatically altering the site and allowing less usable space with these. So I get that, I really don't know that I'm all that opposed. You know, especially over there on Roosevelt Boulevard, where behind you got commercial, both sides you got commercial, blah, blah, blah. You know, now there is a stretch of property back there, for instance, behind this, what'd you say,
Showmars, mhm.
Yeah, you know, so, there's nothing on it.
Right.
It's all grass.
Mm-hmm.
You could even say that was a part of the buffer, if you really want to look at it. So all I'm saying is, that doesn't mean, to me, you know, I can see in the commercial end of it. Now, on the residential side, you know, was where I heard a lot of complaint about the buffer to that area. Now, but now this 50-foot wide buffer, you know, when you go to 5 trees per 100 linear feet, 3 understory trees, 40 shrubs, and a 6-foot wall.
Mm-hmm.
Does that sound a little excessive to me? Probably. You know, so what they don't want, these people don't want, is the property clear cut to the property line.
Right.
And nothing between their back door and some residential or other residential property.
Right.
So as long as we're saving those people.
We
I
are
can be
not
happy.
proposing, yeah, and we are not proposing any changes to the residential chart. So I think Doug maybe handed out another sheet. It looks like this.
This is on the front.
Um, On the back side, you'll see, so this is the chart that staff looks at, and we say, okay, your property is zoned, and then we kind of look over to see what's required. So, for example, if you have a property that's zoned residential low density, and it's another neighborhood that's being developed that is adjacent to another property zoned residential low density, you'd have a type 2 buffer. That is what is currently in the Unified Development Ordinance, and we are not proposing to change that. So you'll see here what is marked out with or showing as red. That's what's changing. If it's black, that is what is currently in the code, and we're not changing that today. So you would still have that 20-foot wide buffer between a new residential development compared to another residential development that's next door to it. You can see we really only made changes mostly with the office medical, and the main reason for that being that office medical is for less intense commercial uses. You've got your offices. You don't have people lining out the door to get their Chick-fil-A sandwich that might be there till 10 o'clock at night. So we didn't feel like the buffers needed to be as intense as a general business property. And then just additional quick changes, we did add some buffers for our mixed use districts, which didn't have any at all. But if you go back to the front of the page that you're probably currently looking at, this actual table type, we really didn't change a whole lot with this either, other than that type 1 buffer, reducing that from a 15 to a 10 foot. And that really just came down to a street yard buffer, making more sense as a 10-foot wide versus 15 or 20. You can see we've really just added clarification language on number 2, just to clarify it's 3 trees per 100 linear feet. And then for 3 and 4, we really just changed it from 6-foot fence, wall, or berm. Same for number 4. Instead of requiring a 6-foot wall, we're allowing them to do a fence, wall, or berm. So just allowing a little bit more flexibility, but still requiring something there.
Here, excuse me,
Yes,
on the berm, and I see why on a 20-foot width, there's not enough room to put a berm probably.
right.
What height are we talking about?
Well, it says 6 foot for the berm. Now, the type 5 has a 5-foot berm specifically listed.
Okay.
And sometimes berms, they don't work, just depending on either the topography of the site or depending on how they have to grade it, or stormwater purposes. So sometimes, berms that just aren't an option, but that's why we wanted to still have the requirement for that screening, but give flexibility.
And when we're talking about a wall, we're talking about either PVC. What happens, and we've seen this countless times, a house will have a very nice wall fence put up in their backyard, it looks great, and while they're 5 years later.
Yeah.
And it is,
Walls are mason.
doesn't look nearly as good.
Yeah, and we do send out quite a few letters as far as dilapidated fences. So it would, at that point, it would just be a zoning violation. We'd have to go through that process to
I
get them
thought
to.
walls were masonry.
Yeah, a wall would be, but we've
A
changed.
fence would be,
A fence could be wood or PVC.
Right.
But we've changed, proposing to change, we hope that you'll agree with it tonight, to allow the fence, wall, or a berm. So they could do a masonry wall, or they could do a fence or a berm.
How is it determined which option?
As far as, as far as whether they do a fence, wall, or berm, ultimately, it's up to the applicant. They have different options they can choose within these types. So it allows some flexibility while still requiring the same width. It just allows flexibility as far as number of trees versus shrubs. So,
Looking at the planned unit development, what is that berm gonna be? What is it now currently? It's 4 and it's gonna be 3, or I can't really.
yes, sorry. So in the, for planned unit development, say up against like a residential rural district, it was a 4, we're proposing a 3, because planned unit developments are residential predominantly. So we tried to make it as consistent with the other residential districts.
Right.
But added a little bit more, knowing that PUDs or PUDs, they can request smaller lot sizes, so sort of that give and take.
The planned urban development, what's the max height of those?
Oh, for the fence or wall, it would be a 6.
No, for the
oh.
actual,
Berm.
it says maximum 4 stories.
That's the story that's the height of the dwellings.
So you could have a 4-story planned urban development. I mean, am I understanding that correctly?
I'm-
Yeah.
So
I just-
it's
I'm not sure.
residential, but it's actually, what could I have there?
I'm not following the full
Well, I
question,
guess
I'm
my
sorry.
question is, it's residential, but I'm not building single houses there, correct?
You could.
But I could also build a 4-story anything, right, correct?
no,
It's residential.
it's residential.
Yeah,
So it's got commercial in it.
potentially up to like 5%.
So I kind of guess my point is reducing it from 50 to 25. It's not, doesn't necessarily have to be residential for a planned urban development. It could have commercial in it too, right?
5% of the, only 5%, but it would be predominantly residential. But it's up to, if you guys wanted to keep that as a type 4, that's certainly up to your discretion as planning board.
I think our thought process was, since it's primarily going to be residential, it's going to be, that's why we did the 3.
But certainly up to planning board's discretion.
So basically in this, you're looking at potentially, if in the 5%, we could have something retail on the bottom, an accounting office.
Yeah,
And
or
then I could have 2 or 3 apartments on top, or townhouses or condos, whatever we want to call them. Flats if we were in England.
But those could be attached to residential rural, residential low density, residential medium density. This is changing that from 50 to 25 feet, where you're actually requiring everything else to have a 50-foot buffer
Right.
residential. So it's not necessarily just strictly residential
And,
Yeah, it's the mixture here.
And,
Yeah.
and I'll just drive home, it's, the maximum they do is 5%, so, but like I said, I mean, staff's not willing to, draw a line and say we won't, but I mean, if y'all feel more comfortable with 4, by all means, we'll keep it 4.
I was just curious on why it dropped to 3, that's all, I mean,
just predominantly residential. is
Because
what
it's
we're
mostly
arguing.
residential,
And that's
okay.
why.
Is there any kind of protocol for materials for walls, like,
There, yes, so I think the code, it basically says masonry, so brick, stone, wood or PVC, or planning director's discretion, but like it couldn't be a chain link fence, but there are
Cinder block?
standards, yeah. Well, it could be cinder block if it's like painted or has, stucco on it
Stucco on
or
it.
something,
oh,
yeah.
well, that would be good.
And I'll be honest, because I've had discussions both residential and commercial. And the residential project I had a discussion with, they had probably a 300 or 400 foot property line that was going to require a wall along the whole entire property line. Which to me, that's just, in my opinion, just my opinion, that's probably a little over the top. And then on commercial projects is where the wall is coming in place too there. And if you have a short property line, it's not that big a deal, but obviously the longer the property line is, if you're running a fence, and I know Councilman Gordon, you don't like fences, nor do I, so it doesn't matter where they're at, whether they're in somebody's yard or whether they're in open space, over time, people just don't maintain fences. Unless, even if it's vinyl, they don't pressure wash it, you get all the grain or mildew looking at this fence, they don't treat it, they might treat it for the first 3 years, but after that, it doesn't get treated, it gets dilapidated. The walls has been a point of concern. I haven't had one person that says, yeah, I'm okay doing the wall. Every project I've talked about, whether it be residential or commercial, there's pushback on the wall for sure.
Any other questions? I know that was a lot of information for buffers.
Well, it is a lot, and it's a little confusing personally, but, and I don't have a personal problem with some of this stuff down, but.
When I guess, and just to, final notes, we're not requesting to make changes to the residential, other than, the PUD. But predominantly, the reason for this perimeter buffer discussion predominantly is for those commercial developments that are adjacent to other commercial projects. As you'll still see, general business, if the property's zoned general business and it's up against a residential district, we haven't proposed to change that. So predominantly, this will impact commercial developments, not commercial up against residential or residential to residential.
Carrie, I have a question.
Yes.
And I've seen this happen several times. We have an existing neighborhood,
Mm-hmm.
and the tract behind them is sold to a developer.
Right,
And the developer clears the land up to the existing neighborhood.
right.
Is there any language written that's gonna, the existing neighborhood, needs a buffer, a good-sized buffer to protect it from everything? Is this,
Yeah, so this would address that. It is a perimeter buffer. We do have tree preservation section as well. With that said, there are times when properties have to be graded a certain way to meet the state stormwater requirements. If that's the case, they do have to go back in and replant according to these buffer requirements. But to say that there is a way to solve that particular issue in every circumstance, I don't know if there is, because there's state stormwater requirements.
Well, right, but there's gonna be at least a 25-foot buffer if it's gonna be residential, and it's gonna be a 50-foot buffer if it's gonna be a commercial project.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just concerned that I don't know if a 25-foot buffer is enough. If you have an existing, we have lots of neighborhoods in Monroe that have mature trees in it.
Right.
Of course, developers come in, clear cut the land, and now these people with backyards that might not have a lot of trees, but trees in it, are now facing this expanse of just dirt.
Well, they do have to have the perimeter buffer around the new site.
But it's a 25-foot
It would depend, but yeah, I mean, 20 to 25-foot buffer, depending on the existing zoning and the adjacent zoning. It would have that buffer.
And with the tree preservation section that we have in the new ordinance too, the requirement is to preserve as many of those large maturing trees as possible. And we do require a tree survey.
Okay.
We didn't have all of that before.
I'm just concerned, I don't know that I think 25 foot is big enough. I'm just, it concerns me, 25 feet is what, from me to that wall? I don't think that's a big enough buffer for an existing neighborhood to have to deal with the issues they're gonna deal with the clear-cut land behind them. Or else we need to do something about stopping clear cutting.
When the tree preservation is an attempt to try to curb that.
Okay.
That size of tree, wanna throw it all out there?
Tree preservation requires you to preserve 75-inch circumference trees, which is a 24-ish inch diameter across, so it's a decent size, and that's throughout the site. And then within the buffers, we want you to preserve those 24-inch circumference trees, which is about an 8-inch tree.
But I'll add this though, Chief, because I just want to make sure everybody's clear. Because from the engineering standpoint, stormwater standpoint, when it rains on that new subdivision you're talking about, Margaret, all the water has to go through the system of that new subdivision, because the state requires the engineering department to do stormwater quantity and quality. So, I know I hear everybody say we don't clear all the property line, but they're not allowed to have the water when it falls to run off to their property. That has to go through their system.
Their system, understand.
And that's a state, that's not a city of Monroe, that's a state mandate that the state requires us to adhere to. So, and that's why, and we talk to people, well, can you, because we tell them, we get beat up, the planning board council about, or from the residents about clearing the property line, but they're required to make sure their stormwater runoff goes through their system.
So it doesn't go through I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, you're
It doesn't go through the neighborhood existing, it would go through their system, it would go through the system of the new.
Yes, it's going through the new neighborhood, because basically, if I'm developing, I'm responsible for my stormwater before it leaves my neighborhood to go to, if you're located downstream, before it goes to you downstream. I'm not allowed to let my water go off over here and just say, oh, you know what, that's not common, it's probably go through my system of my new neighborhood before it leaves my neighborhood and goes downstream to your neighborhood.
Drains and curbs are first.
Commercial, right, whatever's
Yes,
there.
exactly, because obviously it's going to, even commercial, it's going to, they're going to grade it where there's going to be a point on site. And typically, when, especially with the old commission district, they already have theoretically where it's going to be, stormwater can be out based on the grades. Not that was finally, graded and approved, but they have an idea based on grades, so that it's going to go downstream, it's going to be at the lowest point on the site. And then it's going, after the water goes through there, it's going to discharge it and start going, to somebody else's property, which is downstream of, and it's going to be that way for commercial or residential.
That's why they dig the retention ponds first and the curbs and everything go in first, so that that's controlled as they continue to go.
My concern though is not necessarily for the stormwater and stuff that seems to be taken care of. I'm just thinking about aesthetics of me sitting in my backyard and 25 feet away, I've got all of this construction. I just think the buffer needs to be bigger than 25.
I agree with Margaret. I don't know about the fence or wall and that expense. But I'm for bigger buffers, but if nothing more aesthetically.
But for
What's the
bigger,
benefit of making them smaller?
Wider.
We're
But-
not
well, I
proposing
got
to
that,
change
but-
the buffers for residential. So we're not making them smaller than what's currently in the code.
right.
I was talking about commercial.
Well, and just to kind of tie Doug's conversation about the stormwater requirements and treating the runoff, and it's a state mandate, and sometimes that is part of the reasons why they have to grade to clear that, to make sure that water runs that way. But the tree preservation section in the ordinance and the requirement of the tree survey is our tool to try to work with those developers as much as possible to find a middle ground, to for them to still be able to develop their property, but we still try to retain those large maturing trees in at least the perimeter buffers in some areas, because at least 10% of the site has to be preserved no matter what. But then if you think about possibly, the buffers are a little tricky, to be honest with you, and you think about possibly wanting a larger buffer in between existing neighborhoods and residentials, could make it larger, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's gonna be any maturing trees there. There are some vacant lots, so it's kind of sometimes apples to oranges too. Just kind of wanted to throw that out there for thought process too.
You know, even if you said, you know, if you're developing a subdivision and you've got over 50 acres, then your buffer's gonna have to be wider. You know, if you're developing 20 acres, I can understand it's gonna eat up a lot of your land. But if it's over a certain amount of threshold, then the buffer
When we
needs to
start
be.
bumping into us restricting projects and the state coming in and hammering us.
Well, it's just a thought. I think that, you know, we
But it's not a bad thought, but it's just, I mean, one, how do we quantify that? So right now, you're talking about a qualitative thing, and I think none of us in this room would disagree, right? We'd all love to have that. How do we quantify that? And then, because we can't say, if your project has 200 acres on it, we're gonna require you to have much bigger buffers. Well, is it 200 acres that backs up to commercial, or is it 200 acres that touches another residential property, or is it just 200 acres out in the middle? So now what's happening is we're getting back to what we used to have with all the conditional districts. Every time we get a new project, they're going to be coming to us saying, well, we're special, or we're this way, so we need to go from general business to conditional, or from conditional to whatever. So I can appreciate what you're saying, but it's hard to go from the qualitative to the quantitative and make that something that we can all work with as a group, as planning and as city council. So I mean,
I'm just trying to find a way to preserve our existing neighborhoods. The people, you know, moved into, and all of a sudden they've got 300 houses behind them.
Well, and I think, and I haven't dug as deep into the tree preservation as I'm going to this evening or later this weekend, but you know, I think that's going to be our attempt. And I think to what Doug was saying is everybody's going to try to make those preservations, provided we don't bump into stormwater issues. If we run into water runoff and it has to be graded a certain way and it has to take out more trees than anticipated to meet state requirements, we're going to have to do that. But they have to put those trees back. So
How big are trees, though?
There is, in the tree preservation ordinance, there's mitigation. It's a ranging scale. Basically, if the tree you had to take out was between 10 and 25 inches, your new tree has to be a certain size, and you may even have to put 2 or 3 trees of that size to make up for the one tree that you took out. And then the next scale is the 26 to 75 inch circumference. Again, I think it's a slightly larger tree, but you have to maybe do 4 trees to replace that one tree.
That's good.
Yeah, I mean, so, and I think, you know, to the degree that planning has started changing the conversation with a lot of these developers, if we get one that comes to us that way and they're going to have to put trees back in, we can also ask them to put some shrubs back in. They're going to be a little faster growing than the trees.
That's what my thought was.
So
How long they take the trees to grow.
I think we can ask that of them, and if they're smart developers, Stephen Bennett, they won't disagree with us as we want to help and have the best quality project we can get. So again, I appreciate everything you're saying, and I don't disagree with it, but I don't know how to quantify the quality of what you're saying. I think the tree preservation makes a really good attempt at that.
I agree.
So-
I'm trying my best to.
You know, I think a lot too, Margaret, of the clear-cut properties we've seen have been properties we've annexed. and they've already bulldozed every plant down, and then they come to us. And we've had no ability to
Right.
to stop that. But if somebody goes by the UDO strictly, Richard, I'm not sure if we could then require them to do more than what is actually said here.
Oh, you should come to one of our meetings. We never require, but we sure do ask.
Well, that's good.
And we're very persuasive in asking. I got a question, Carrie. Is the buffer issue as it pertains right now holding up projects? Do we have projects on hold or people that aren't bringing projects because of the buffers?
I would say that there are people probably on hold to see what happens tonight for commercial developments, because it is very possible that what we currently have could certainly kill their project. Would you?
Okay.
Okay, yeah, commercial, like I said, we're not proposing changes for residential
So there's-
other than PUD.
Other than PUD, and we can decide to keep PUD at 4 if we don't want to go to 3.
I would agree with there should never be a time when you have, I think the max is 6 units per acre, and it's a 10-acre minimum. There should never be a time when you have to look out at 60 units in what could possibly be a 4-story building with 5% commercial and not have that 50-foot buffer, but then require it from a neighborhood business. I think that any time that you have something like that, there should be a 50-foot buffer.
So you're saying stay with 4, not go with 3?
Right, I agree with the commercial stuff. I get it. I understand that. You don't want to block everything off. But that planned urban development, the existing neighborhood shouldn't have to look over at what's going to be, what possibly could be buildings.
All right, so let me reframe what you're saying. If we kept it as a 4 and we had to vote on that this evening, you're comfortable moving forward with approval at 4?
Yep.
Straw vote. Anybody else got a problem with staying at 4? All right, sounds good. That being said, are there any other further questions from planning for staff?
I'd like to add just a comment.
Yes, sir.
Number one, I think that adding the options of walls and berms to fences and not limiting to simply a wall, but giving you the option is acknowledging the fact that every piece of property is not exactly the same and adds options to the UDO. And options are always a good thing.
I agree.
Also want to point out when it comes to redevelopment of commercial property, by bringing the buffer down to 10 feet, we also have to acknowledge that when they redevelop the property next to that one, they're going to have the same 10-foot requirement. So you're always going to have a minimum of a 20-foot buffer, vegetation buffer between 2 businesses, and that will look nice.
I agree.
Down the road. Just some comments on it.
Margaret, are you comfortable moving forward this evening?
I am comfortable.
Good. All right. David, I would entertain a motion.
All right. I make a motion to recommend the adoption of the ordinance amending chapter 157, section 8.3.
And first it would be the resolution.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Top. See, it's not as easy as it's when I do it right.
I make a motion to recommend the adoption of the resolution approving the land use and transportation plan compliance. Is that correct?
This doesn't have anything to do with further comments, does it? Because I've got some.
There's still be a
Planning
general.
board only right now, though.
Okay. So do we need to include the PUD goes to 4?
With the amendment that the PUD stays at 4 and is not reduced to 3.
I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, sir. Do I have any further discussion from planning? Hearing none. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? None. That motion carries.
Okay.
David, is there anything else up there we need to read?
Yeah, the ordinance.
Okay. Lisa jumped on.
Sorry, I thought you were done too.
That's okay. So, you want to read the next one?
Motion to recommend the adoption of the ordinance amending chapter 157, section 8.3, landscaping, buffering, fences, and walls of the Unified Development Ordinance.
As amended.
The PUD, we remain at 4.
I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. I have a second. Ms. Smith. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? That carries unanimously. And now, thank you very much, Planning Board. We'll go back to Lisa.
Well, planning staff appreciates both of those text amendments. You know, we had the technical text amendment with the minor changes, and then we had the landscaping buffering. Just wanted to remind, it will go for a public hearing at the City Council November 8th meeting, before there was any other discussion you wanted to have.
My biggest concern, you've done a good job today, my biggest concern is build by right. It's too open. The city council, the buck should stop with us and the planning board. And I wish I could take credit for writing this, but I'm not smart enough, you know, the truth about it. So I'm gonna ask if Ken would read this. I think it's very important, and I think it's something that the council can buy into, but I got a real problem with us not being able to make the final decision. And listen, people that already own a house in this town have got to be taken care of. Don't look at them as if they don't give taxes and everything else for a long year, and all of a sudden we're not considering them, we're considering all you. Got a problem with that.
Ashley, what's the state statutes or restrictions on the build by right that can we make changes to that, or can we govern that?
We can, well, we have our ordinance standards that describes what can be built by right. So if we want to make changes to that, that would be allowable. There's just certain things that we can't condition, like for a build by right, we can't say we want anybody to build by right to have certain aesthetic changes, like materials to the house or something, things like that we can't require.
Can we require size?
Can you throw the site plan for the
But there are some
Arborwood
things from our
townhomes
ordinance
up
that we
there?
can, that those are not allowed to be changed by state law.
Okay.
We can
Thank you.
talk about
I'll talk in
ordinance-related
generality.
matters, but I don't think I can't throw the Arborwood site plan up because
No.
it's a specific project. Sorry.
You can speak in hypotheticals.
Okay, and hypotheticals. In hypotheticals, the citizens of Monroe, basically, we put you guys in office, and we can keep you there or vote you out, depending on if we like the work that you're doing. And we all want to like the work that you're doing. People in Monroe want quality, sustainable neighborhoods. I wrote you 6 pages of a lot of words, but to summate it up is, if you have a build by right project that comes into the heart of our
We
community.
don't have that, Ken.
I'll give you this one.
Oh, you know it by heart. Thank you.
If you have a build by right neighborhood of over 100 units, townhome units, single resident units, whatever, that's being built in the heart of the town, there are a lot of impacts on the citizens for that. And that's a capital improvement of land. It's also a capital impact on our resources. Monroe's done a great job in water, the sewage, utility services to service these new neighborhoods. But when it's built by right, if I come in and I want to develop 200 homes on a small piece of property, then you better put up the bucks to build the infrastructure to support it. I'm not required to build the infrastructure under build by right. I don't have to build any water lines other than from the city box to the houses. I don't have to build any sewers if they don't already exist. And we
Come
have
out for a
no-
subdivision, Ken?
That's
Yeah, subdivision.
not accurate.
What's not accurate about it?
Well, there's 2 forms of residential development approval process. There's your by right, which is the staff level approval, and we discussed this at the September meeting, and this is a slide from that. And by right development is not a new thing in the new Unified Development Ordinance. It's always been within the ordinance, and it is within almost every municipality's ordinance. But just because it's a by right subdivision, that doesn't mean it doesn't go through a staff level review from all the departments with the city.
I
Water
agree.
and sewer, electric and gas,
But are
building,
these people
planning.
reviewing it and approving it in open council session? Or
Where
is it
there's,
being
my
approved?
only reason answering that is they are required to still meet the city's ordinance requirements, whether it's by right or
That's my
conditional
point.
district.
It should be the council's responsibility to approve capital developments, large subdivisions wherever they're at, and not something that can be built by right. When they build them by right, they don't give you any amenities. They, depending on the district, if they're an overlay district, you couldn't even put one of these townhomes on it that we said has to be a minimum 25 foot. It gets very difficult at that point, but they can still put it in their build by right. It becomes a density thing that they're throwing 200 residences in the middle of an area that should have half that much. If you want to build by right, sure, you can build by right, but if you're a developer from Texas or Charlotte or wherever that wants to come in here, throw up as many little boxes as they can and sell them and go away and not worry about what happens to them afterwards, we have to take that on board. We have to maintain it forever. And I just think that if somebody wants to come in here and develop a large project, they should have to go through the review process of the planning board, and they should have to go to city council for approval. In the UDO, as it's written right now, you, city council, have delegated a significant amount of your responsibility to the planning director. You've made it her job to do these things. She's doing her job. But to the residents that are out here seeing these strip mines going on, they're going to call you, and you're not going to know what they're talking about because you didn't know about it. You never heard about it. When you did ask for a briefing to be brought up to date, you're briefed that there's 5 processes or 5 build by right programs underway. You didn't get any detail on how big, the impact, how condensed, what the density is. You know, if it's got 5 people or 5 units per acre or 15 units per acre, you don't know that. So you can't answer your constituents' questions, but you're certainly going to get the feel of their anger over this development that they don't feel fits in their neighborhood.
I do have to say a couple things regarding the comments. Once again, by right development does go through a review process. It's a review process with representatives from the city and various different departments, energy services, water resources, building, planning, engineering. It doesn't necessarily come through a council, planning board and council review process, but they are required to meet our city ordinances in every department as well as the state codes. We also do have, open space standards in our code now, so they are required to meet amenities. We do not have any new projects that are by right that have been submitted under the new ordinance. All the projects are under the old ordinance where we did not have a lot of these ordinance requirements in place to provide a better quality neighborhoods. Now, there's a couple that have fallen within our Concord Avenue overlay district, but just to kind of point that out, they do have to meet our current ordinance requirements, open space, signs, tree preservation, development requirements of lot sizes, and so forth.
Mr. Deal, can I interject something here real quick? Sure. There are two new by right types of development. One is a conservation subdivision and one is a cluster development. Both allowed by administrative decision a 45 or 50% respectively reduction in lot size. They promote higher density and the bare minimum is 5 acres. It also allows for an administrative increase in density from 3 to 4 dwellings in residential medium density. That's all done administrative. It's all by right. The UDO states that a conservation development is intended to provide reasonable economic use of land which may have unique environmental conditions that would otherwise make development undesirable. I don't know why we'd want to develop something that's undesirable to be developed. I mean, who would want to live there? But I will kind of break it down to it since there's a conversation about open space. The UDO allows the following to be considered open space to make these conservation and cluster developments work. Buffers, special flood hazard areas, areas of at least 5,000 square feet in size with slopes greater than 25%, streets and driveway crossings, septic and drainage areas, a limited number of parking spaces, public utilities, required drainage and utility easements, areas with a natural slope greater than 20%, stormwater management facilities. You know, I wonder if that even at some point, what are we trying to conserve? I mean, if we're trying to conserve utilities, if we're trying to conserve a slope that's greater than 25%, but yet we're allowing this to be done by right, and we're allowing all of the homes to be placed on 50% of that 5 acres. So you're moving all of the houses to 50% to conserve what I just read off. In a cluster development, I'll give you an example. If you look at a cluster development, it has to be 5 acres in size, has to be in residential medium density. If you take 25 acres, take 30% open space because that's the requirement. You end up with 17.5 acres per building at 700,000 square feet. You have to do 3 types of residences. Type 1 residential is 6,500 square foot lot. You do 60 of those. You do 20 8,000 square foot lots. You do 20 townhomes, which is 3 per building. Make those 1,500 square foot lots. On that 17.5 acres, you could end up with over 100 residences in residential medium density. That's by right. You can't have any say in it. It's just done by right. And that's a cluster development. That's in residential medium density. That was put into the new UDO. Conservation subdivision example would be 15 acres. It's got to have 50% open space. Again, it can be any one of those things I named to you. You would have 7.5 acres per building. You would do 35 single family residences on 7.5 acres. Or I'm sorry, yeah, 7.5 acres. 35 on 7.5 acres. That's by right.
Well, as a council member, the people that went out to vote, they look to us when somebody's running over their neighborhood. And I think it's, I just think it's very important that we have a say in it and the planning board. I don't know what other communities are doing, but I think that our first responsibility should be to look after the existing homes in this town, protect them. We got now about 8,000 rooftops that have already been approved that hadn't been built on them. So, as a council member, you know, I don't mind saying it. I think that's part of our responsibility. And as far as your UDO, that's fine, but I don't agree with taking the final say-so away from the planning board and city council.
Just to clarify one thing, that's not the only by right developments we have.
Sure.
You can still,
Sure.
I know somebody today.
It's 2 new, they were specifically set up.
2 types.
Correct, to allow this type of.
But you can still develop by rights. We have
Of
a
course.
RLD.
I think we should do like Indian
and
Trail and consider them conditional.
RMD, and it's like today.
Well, they consider, Indian Trail considers those 2, they have similar. I think there's this open space, and I forget what the other name is, but they're very, very similar. They consider them conditional. They start at 10 for what would be 10 acres, what would be our cluster development, where we're at 5. They have their open space, which they don't, their minimum's 25 acres. You can't do what we would consider a conservation, which is reduce everything down to 50% and leave the open space. They don't start that till 25 acres. Their lot sizes are almost twice as large as ours. So I guess my concern would be that, and believe me, I've done my research. I mean, the conservation subdivision shall be reviewed, approved, or approved with conditions by the director in accordance with the standards. That's not going to you, that's approved and even with conditions. And so my
Next to
concern.
the last page in there are 6 recommendations, and one of them covers that.
So hold on, let's
It
let
should
let's
be
let
changed
Doug
to
let's
come
let
back
Doug
to-
finish. He
Yeah, I
was
wasn't finished.
let him get going.
There's that's not the only two by right developments. There's by right because we have an RMD, and we have RLD. RLD is also by right. You can do 20,000 square foot lots, and you have required open space. So that's just not the only two types of open space. And furthermore, too, though, when development comes, when you mentioned Mr. Deal as far as we're extending the water and sewer, that's not how it works. If somebody's going to develop property, the developer has to extend the water and sewer to serve that property. The city doesn't pay that bill. That developer does that. That's kind of the cost of doing business. So just make sure you understand that the developer has to pay for the water and sewer to be extended to serve. If the water's not, sewer's not there, they have to pay to get to that property so they can utilize it.
We're talking about in-town development, the water and sewer already exists.
Well, you stated that if it was not there, the city was extending it. I just want to clarify, if the sewer's not there,
If you build 200 houses and all of a sudden it is more capacity than the city has on the city's side of the line.
then the city wouldn't approve it then if there wasn't capacity.
They wouldn't approve
That, that's,
hookups.
that's why,
And the UDO that allows.
well, that's
That's
why,
what water
as Lisa said,
resources
that when it's submitted, it's routed to every single department to have a bite at the apple. And if the capacity was not there, water resources wouldn't approve it. Water resources can't approve it if there's no capacity there to approve it. So we have our ordinance requirements, and water resources, they have, I don't work for water resources, I'm not an engineer, but they have, if the capacity's not there, they very well can't approve it.
And we very well had projects submitted, and they basically said the capacity isn't there, the extension, there's no water. Now granted, this was an annexation, just to be clear, there is no capacity issue that I'm aware of, but it was an extension issue, and basically Water Resources said it's not available, and that project hasn't moved forward.
Well, and I will say the conservation subdivision was one of those text amendments that we had on there that needs some improvement. And I'm glad we made the decision to just talk about the landscaping and buffering, because there's no way we would have been able to discuss all of those major text amendments. But that was one area that we saw that needed some improvement, and we've already agreed that it needs to go from 5 acres. We proposed 10 acres. We've already agreed that those primary conservation features need to be revised, which we've proposed to do. There may be some other things that needs to be revised in there. So that is one that's going to be coming back through the process.
Lisa, can I ask a hypothetical question? Because I know we can't speak specifically, and this isn't specific, because I know we've communicated on one particular question, but hypothetically speaking, if a project were presented that was a commercial project that allowed for, say, apartments to be built at the same time, that is by right belongs to whoever purchased that land, and it is going to, not adjoin is the right word, but it'll be close to an older existing neighborhood under what we're looking at right now. And I'm trying to understand too, and thank you all for all this. This is necessary process, all of this discussion. How would a citizen, because this is part of what we're discussing as well, how would a citizen address a concern if it goes to through an administrative approval process? And there's a lot of steps to that. I understand all of that and the things that Doug has spoken to. If there were a question, how would they be aware of anything they needed to ask? Like, okay, you see people out there surveying land. What's happening? Those are the kinds of questions. I know they're having neighborhood meetings, but they're not always informative or completely accurate. according to what you all, are communicating. I'm talking about you're accurate, and the information the citizens are getting is not necessarily completely accurate. So how can that be bridged? And currently, the way we're operating, and I know you're talking about some of these topics we'll cover at a different time, which I think is great. But there's some folks here tonight that are wondering the answers to some of those questions, and I think that would be helpful to, inform what comes next, I guess, is my question. As cloudy as all that was.
So my question, and I don't want to put a damper on yours.
No, you're not.
Is that something we want to address now and this evening?
That's my question.
No, I think that's what you've said and what Ken and David have said is a much bigger, broader topic.
For another time.
For another time.
I've
Staff
got
needs to get together and have some discussion on this.
I understand.
There'll be some conversation with staff and council. Planning will get brought back in when we need to, but I think we're at a good point to call it an evening if everybody is in agreement with that. I see a lot of head nodding.
Well,
David's making a scowly face.
I'm certainly glad that this has come up because this is important.
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, I don't want to minimize it, but I don't know, I'm just looking at our capacity to address something like that
I'm
this
not
evening.
asking for an answer, I'm just saying, it's my perception for what we're doing now. We're taking this, you took 2 topics off of this list, we discussed what we needed to discuss, and this is not the last type of discussion we'll have.
Oh, no.
Every question will be answered, but those things will be discussed and addressed as well. For those who are here to hear some things, I think that's an important thing to
David, you had
say.
something?
I think we as a planning board need to look at this. We need to have a meeting ourselves. We need to go over some of these things. And we need to, as a body, start moving some stuff up towards the council, and maybe making some recommendations on what can be done.
Well, I'll tell you what, I will meet with Lisa and Doug.
I'll be more than happy to meet with you as well.
Okay. But as far as kind of trying to figure out when they can make a presentation on it to us and we can put it on our agenda.
And thank you
All
all
right,
for all
that'll
your-
be at a future
really.
meeting.
And I would warn you not to avoid the staff. They can tell you what's in
Yes.
the pipeline.
Yes.
If what you're talking about is hypothetical and there's nothing out there on the board for it now anyway, it is premature. And we will all have plenty of time to discuss these things and try to come up with some solution.
I understand.
that will Hopefully suit
Yeah,
other people.
that was the clarification I was
And
asking.
I'll add
Thank
one
you,
thing.
Freddie.
Too. Obviously, you might not like exactly the way the cluster is and the conservation, but I will say I've already done 2 reviews on 2 projects for both those, and they didn't like our comments, and they walked. So
Right. Understood.
everybody in the room might not like the way it is, but I'll say neither the developer from their developer side, they didn't like the comments which came out, which from the by right standpoint, they didn't like our comments either because they pulled out of the project. So, but can we modify and tweak it? Sure.
Sorry.
It's okay. You're fine.
If a developer decided that he wanted to buy a parcel of land that he found through a realtor or whatever, how does that person know? Where do they know to go? Do they go to the deed room to pull up that property information from plats or whatever? Or do they know to come directly to you all to get information on how to proceed and what all of the requirements that go along with that?
It's in the UDO.
But how would they know to do that?
Well, if they're a developer, they would know.
Well, say they're not,
If it's in the city of Monroe, once they figure out, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to figure out where the property's located. And if it's in the city of Monroe, they'll come find us.
Yeah, because they got to get permits.
And quite honestly, they're either going to call us first or call Water Resources to see, hey, where's the sewer line at? Is there sewer to the property, or am I having to extend sewer? That's because a lot of times they'll call a Water Resource for and call us to see where the sewer's at, but if not, or they'll meet with us to find out, based on what it's zoned and can I do this or can I do that?
All right, planning board, any further discussions, any thoughts? Everybody, all right. Mr. Mayor, the planning board would entertain a motion to adjourn.
All right. let me see, does staff have anything else they want to offer? Does it make any difference who goes first?
City council should go.
Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to thank our staff for a well-prepared presentation, as always. You know, when we adopted this UDO back in the spring, we indicated it was a living document, and it will ebb and flow and change like a river over time, depending on circumstances, how much water flow, how much erosion, whatever. So I thank the staff for your hard work. Thank the planning board for all the heavy lifting you guys do, and appreciate all the time you spend on our projects. To our visitors, we thank you very much, and to fellow council members, we thank you for all your hard work. So I will now entertain a motion to adjourn.
Richard had one down.
The planning board has, I make a motion for the planning board to adjourn.
The council goes first.
Council first, okay.
Well, we got a motion and a second. All in favor, raise your hand, please. That motion carries. We are adjourned.
Mr. Ali made a motion for the planning board to adjourn. I second. All in favor, say aye. Aye. We are adjourned. Thank you.
I didn't know I did, but thank you.
I think there's some opposition to this table.
I disagree.
Look at Margaret Walker.